Jean, welcome to the Buy, Grow, Sell podcast.
Simon, great to see you. Thank you.
No, I appreciate you making time and coming on the show. I'm really excited to unpack your story and hear a little bit more about your business. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Prairie Metal Recycling?
That's correct. Yeah. So that was one of them. And as we stumbled upon that type of industry from another company that I owned. But yes, that was the one that we scaled up quite quickly and ended up exiting.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think anything to do with scrap metal, I personally find quite interesting. I've seen quite a few businesses in that space. But maybe you could kick off for us and give us a little of your background on kind of what led you to starting that business.
Yeah, so I think the term is like the serial entrepreneur. So I started my first company when I was 18. I got into the like a house painting franchise. It's quite popular here in Canada and the US too, I think. And that's when I kind of got the wake up call. It was a real lesson on how business actually works. I was studying business at university at the time. And, I decided in my youthful haste and arrogance to drop out of a full scholarship, my degree in my last year. And, but you know what? I thought, I'm going to get into business. So I had started to go out and I was working with a company that had a couple eBay stores, and the owner got really bored of it. So I figured out how to buy the company from him. And so one of those companies, to kind of fast forward the story, is we were at the time the second largest eBay store in Canada selling fractional bullion pieces, which is really a fancy way of saying coins and bars. But if you're not the authentic coin, you can't call it a coin. You have to call it bullion or rounds. And nonetheless, we had a lot of precious metals. We had semi-precious metals. So we had everything from gold and silver. We also had platinum, but we had the really exotic stuff like platinum, palladium, molybdenum, stuff that I had never heard about before. So we had like 50 of these. And so we were essentially manufacturing them in China and then selling them. We were doing retail in Canada, US, but we also had wholesale partners all around the world. And so that was a really fun business. And our number one fastest growing item was copper. And so some people were buying these things as just like probably junk trinkets, I believe. I don't know. But others were actually buying it because they believed that this was a really good investment opportunity. At the time, though, copper in China was just getting crazy expensive, and it was getting to the point where it was harder and harder to manufacture it because a lot of our pieces were pretty much a big piece of commodity. And so I had attended a seminar and learned all about this concept named vertical integration. And I thought, okay, well, where can I get, copper at its cheapest form? And so this is where I stumbled upon the idea of, okay, I'm going to go find a scrap metal yard. I'm going to go buy this business so I can get the cheapest form of copper. And so that led me to this little scrap yard in the south part of our province in Canada, here in Manitoba, probably 30 minutes from the US border, which then led me down to another province in Saskatchewan where I started to negotiate terms on buying a scrap yard. So, yeah.
Huh. It's not often that we get owners that are buying in first. Our podcast is called Buy, Grow, Sell, right? Because it kind of represents a cycle. People get in, you either buy or you do a startup to get in, and then you're growing, and then one day you exit. It just so happens, I think most people these days, a majority anyway, are selling to exit. So I love the fact that you've actually done the whole acquisition piece, and it's not even your first acquisition, right?
No, at the time, I actually acquired another business before all this, the one that I skipped over. It was a little paintball company, and I acquired it on a vendor take-back loan. So in other words, I just got the vendor to basically, finance the acquisition or the purchase. So I just paid them over time. I implemented some pretty quick and easy things, some systems and processes, and I was able to repackage it and sell the business for 3 times what I essentially didn't pay for in a matter of 9 months. And that's really when I
Oh,
started to
wow.
get hooked on, and I was in my early 20s, and I thought, oh, this is fun. Of course, maybe a little bit of beginner's luck, but they're not all that easy. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
when I really got hooked on this idea of, oh, I can really come in, buy them, preferably low, do a lot of work, and then get out at a premium. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. With the scrap metal business, without diving too deep here, I guess, but what were the sort of typical terms? Did you pay cash? Did you get a vendor financing? What did that look like?
So yeah, this is a really weird turn of events. So we agreed that I would buy the business. I believe it was for $2 million. There were some assets, but if you know anything about scrap yards, they run the oldest equipment ever. They run it right down to the ground, and then they still use it and patch it. So, you know, thankfully for me, okay, there was some equipment there, but really what I looked at is we were making between 500 and 700,000 a year in profit. And, and there was a bit of land that I could acquire as part of that. And so for me, I thought, hey, I can do a vendor take back. And if needed, I can try to convince the bank to lend against the assets as well down the road if I wanted to get the past owners out of here.
Yeah.
However, the owners did say to me, well, first of all, you're a city boy. You know nothing about the country. And we were how far up? 10 hours drive north, maybe 11, 12 hours north of the US border. So, we were so
Yeah.
far north that, in the summertime, the sun's up till like 11:30 p.m. I don't know if that's a strange thing for you guys down there, but
Yeah, for
for us,
sure. Yeah.
so we were really out in the middle of nowhere. I had never driven a semi truck, heavy equipment, any of this stuff. I grew up in the city. So they said, we need to see that you can actually do this, though. So we're going to give you a 6-month trial. You can come in, work a busy season with us, and then we can close the transaction at the end of the season in the off season. And I thought, sure. And
Cool.
we negotiated some pretty good. I was going to get compensated for that, so we went off. So I went and got my truck license in a matter of a few weeks, and off we went. And so I started to help out in the company. And of course, this is already one of my mistakes that I regret. So I not only just got in there and learned the business, but I immediately started to implement changes and started to really just, well, why do we do it this way? Let's change this. So I implemented a digital scale. I put cameras in. I equipped all the drivers with, I think at the time we were iPhone 4s, but it was still like leading edge stuff. I think the cameras are starting to get good enough where we could take real time pictures of paperwork. I was putting stuff into the cloud. I mean, this is back in 2012 where the cloud was still fairly new. And, so we were doing now real-time information, analytics. I had established a contract with Hyundai out in South Korea. We were loading containers and shipping them to the coast and then sending them out on barges. And so I learned the whole business. And towards the end of the season, the owners, even though they were getting into I think they were in their early 60s at the time, the price now all of a sudden changed for them, because
Yeah.
the older gentleman that was selling goes, this isn't such a bad business to own after all. I kind of spent a lot of my time in the office. I was able to kick up my feet, and we actually made a lot of money. We were able to, really crack down on some of our heavy expense areas, and so I basically worked against myself for an increased price. So that
Yeah.
was,
Wow.
yeah. So, so
But on
the
the same,
key is you
by the
buy,
same,
then grow. Don't grow it before you buy.
yeah. Look, and that's a really, I mean, that's a really great lesson. I mean, I guess on the positive side of things, you also had the benefit of getting to know the business. You learned it in and out. You learned what not to do. In some ways, you've probably de-risked that transaction and the forward sort of projections of the business.
Yes, yeah, I learned a ton, and, while we were there was always these farmers that would pull up to the yard, and they wanted to sell us this farm equipment, and they wanted a good price for it, but we kept turning them away because we're in our industry, we're dealing with a lot of heavy, high density, industrial scraps, so heavy
Yeah.
plate stuff, big bars. And so farm equipment, it's designed fairly light, and we would call it popcorn scrap in that was a term we would use because it's just big, fluffy, not heavy in density. And if you know anything about scrap metal, you're getting paid by the pound or by the ton,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so fast forward, we were finishing the due diligence on the transaction, and in a really weird turn of events, this is when social media was still fairly early and new, I guess. They had discovered that my wife back home at the time had moved on to a new relationship. And so I didn't know about
Ah.
this because I had been blocked from all these channels, but they weren't. And she didn't know who they were. So being the vendors that were about to finance me, they said, okay, well, look, we naturally feel for you, but we're not going to be your lenders if you're going to be about to enter into a divorce. So why don't you go figure that out? We'll hold on to this for up to a year, and if you sort that out, we're here. Don't worry about it. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah. So long story short, I did, the marriage was done. Yeah, I was just the last one to know about it. And, and, the business, I didn't actually close on it. But if you could remember when I was learning about the business, I can't remember that all these farmers wanted to constantly sell us the scrap metal. And so that's when the idea was born. I thought, okay, well, um, I had all these connections in the smelters where to sell the scrap metal. And so we did a smoke test. In other words, we put up some ads. We thought, I wonder how many of these farmers are out there. And we thought maybe we can do this for like a summer or two and, you know, try it out. And we just completely got flooded with inquiries from farmers. And so we
Wow.
thought, okay, we might have a business here.
That's fascinating. So the fact that you didn't actually close out that scrap, that was unexpected for me. I was waiting for you to come
Right.
back and close the deal.
I've been told not to talk about those things, but that divorce was a quite a significant part, and in some
Yeah.
ways, it led me down a different path. So
Hey, you know what? Like it's life, isn't it? I mean, I don't think there's any point in sort of shying away from it. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just stuff happens, right? And as you say, I think those sort of situations, you know, well, I'll share one of my friends and advisors said to me during COVID. He said, this everybody runs around saying, in a crisis, that these sort of situations build character. He said, I don't agree with that. He said, I think it reveals character. I think you're already that person. And when you are put to the stress and you are put under the blowtorch, it reveals who you really are.
right,
And,
I would agree.
I do think that's true. Yeah. And I think clearly you've come out the other side and, obviously been very, very successful with what you do. So, congrats and well done. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so yeah, we went off and started this company. We called it Prairie Metal Recycling. Why did I name it that? Well, I was just trying to find a name that would rank best on search engine optimization at the time. And, this is the early days. So I thought, okay, what are these farmers going to look for? And so, and to give context, where we are and were in Canada is Manitoba, the province of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So earlier you were telling me about your trip to Canada. You
Yeah.
flew over those two provinces because it's flat, it's boring, it's agricultural. We're not
Yeah.
necessarily a tourist spot, but this is like the heartland of growing crops. We have some of the best crops that come out of this land in the world. So
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. It
that's
was,
why.
I got, I've got,
Go
Oh,
ahead. Go
sorry
ahead.
to talk over you. I was just going to say I got a taste of what you're talking about in that we came driving out of the Rockies and on our way to Calgary, and all of a sudden it just goes from you're really high up to it's really really flat, and everything was kind of this yellowy color, and I thought, wow, like it was such a radical change of landscape in such a short space of time that it just blew us all away.
Yeah, we just did that drive back in March, and just wait till you cross the border into Saskatchewan. It gets really flat.
Yeah, cool,
But
cool. Anyway,
the
sorry, I didn't
advantage
mean to interrupt you.
No, and so the advantage to that is that there's been hundreds of years of farm equipment that's just been kind of accumulating in all of these back pastures of these farms. And so one of the key things is that we had some relationships with the major smelter there in the capital of Regina, or capital of Saskatchewan, in the city of Regina. And so we went and started to negotiate. And so historically, they would not accept farm equipment either. So there was a bit of this. That's why there was such a backlog of farm equipment. And so, being the entrepreneur that we are, we don't take no for an answer very well. And so, I just kept asking, well, what's it going to take? What's this going to take? And finally, we got a hold of someone. Turns out this company was owned head office out of Moscow, but they had North America office in Chicago. Got a hold of some VP and said, "Look, we're just not going to take no for an answer. So how much volume do we need to bring in to make it worthwhile? Because we know this is going to take you more time to process. But if you got the volume, you can assign the crew, the equipment. We know we can make a deal. So the guy says, okay, look, if you can bring in 1,000 tons in 30 days, you got my attention. And so to give you an idea, like we've had identified a couple competitors out there, and they were probably doing 100 to 200 tons a month. So the guy basically just said, bugger off, right? Like, don't
Yeah.
bug us. So before the 30 days hit, we had brought in over 2,000 tons. And
Wow.
so the guy calls me up and goes, who are you? Or who the hell are you? And where the hell are you getting this stuff? And so we got his attention. And and to fast forward, we had a pretty good relationship. It was interesting working with. I had never worked with Russians before. That was an interesting. Had a few interesting twists, but nonetheless, we managed to grow this thing where we were bringing in over 30,000 tons per summer, and summer for us is not a big season. It's really end of May until end of September, perhaps October if you're lucky. Because if you know anything about Canada, after that, we're pretty much covered in snow.
Absolutely. Wow. It's I, my brain naturally goes to the logistics of all this. I mean, how did you get over what sort of area did you collect 2,000 tons of metal, and how the hell did you get it? Where did you take it all back to one location? Like, I mean, we could probably talk for 3 hours just on that alone, but I was just curious how you get that done.
Yeah, so thankfully, I did a bit of work. I did a bit of consulting work before this for logistics companies, so I had a bit of a logistics background, and I started to think about, okay, well, you know, what if we were the 1-800 got junk for scrap metal, and what if we took the scrap metal model, but we were just on demand scrap metal, so we were a scrap yard without the yard. And so, a couple other things we did too, and since I had already been in the e-commerce business, I was quite fluent with technology and, pardon me, my automation here. It's in the evening for me, so all my automation is turning off in the background.
Cool.
And so because I was familiar with technology, I was able to start to plot out, we had a radius of 800 kilometers. So in miles, I believe that's about 500 miles. I think, yeah,
Yeah,
about
we're
500 miles.
kilometers here anyway, so that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So if anybody's in the U.S., sorry, y'all
Yeah,
took
yeah,
too long.
yeah.
So and so it was a big spread, and the biggest challenge when I had observed the last company, because the company that I was trying to buy in Saskatchewan before, they would always just scribble stuff down on a piece of paper, and so I had figured out how to get land locations, which is a way of actually identifying specific plot of land in the middle of nowhere, because Google Maps does not, or it did not work at the time if you said, I want to go to the middle of nowhere. So I had to figure that out. I brought in some software. At the time, it was Salesforce before they were ridiculously expensive. I started to geomap things. And this is also, and so my guys already had, by now we're doing iPhone 5s, 5Ss. So we actually had a little bit of horsepower and GPS. And so that was really one of the big drivers and catalysts for us, because our biggest expense was burning fuel. At one point we were burning $22,000 of fuel per week, just moving all this scrap metal around. So, if you can get efficient and make sure that you're not just going like this all around the province, you're going to save that kind of money. And sure enough, we did. That was really our focus on year 2, 3, 4 before we sold.
Yeah, right. So talk to me about that growth then a little bit. It's you started with yourself. Did you have a business partner? When did you start bringing on employees? How big did the team get? What did all that look like?
Yeah. So the son of the scrap metal that I was trying to buy in Saskatchewan, we had interacted over that summer that I worked there, and so we ended up partnering together. And so that really helped because he had some background. We knew where to import our big magnets from Italy and our grapples from the south part of the U.S. And we were flying around all around the country at auctions, buying equipment for pennies on the dollar almost, and then transporting it back. So we had a lot of fun together as the adventure. Um, and we were just great partners. He was really he did identify as on the spectrum for autism, so he was Asperger's. And to me, that was just such an interesting learning experience because he would always call me the emotional one, and he would not be emotional, and he would be so rational, and he would just, and if I have a few friends or acquaintances in my life that that are on the spectrum, and if you know anything about it, they love to one or two things they just focus in on. And for my partner, for him, it was business, so he would just nonstop strategize, and we talking about this nonstop. So, he helped with a lot with the operations. He ran the heavy machinery and he liked to load. And that's really all he wanted to do. Whereas I got out there, started hiring the drivers, the salespeople. I was the main salesperson at first. And the idea there was really how can we, well, there's two things. Number one, our competitors, when they would go out to buy scrap metal from the farmers, they were, they would actually make a bigger mess than they would clean up. So so we realized that if we're gonna have to fight a stigma already. So we're gonna have to position ourselves as not a scrap metal company, but actually as a farm cleanup company. And so
Yeah,
that's why we bought these big expensive magnets that had like 6 Tesla of lift. Like it was amazing. Like you can almost
wow.
lift a car with a magnet. And so whereas our competitors, they would take like 6 weeks. They would go there, often cherry pick a lot of the good stuff, but leave a mess on the farm. Sometimes they were torching, which is a risk to burn things. And when we came in, we would be in and out within about 6 hours, for example. Sometimes a little longer, but and we would do a very good job cleaning up. So that was a big advantage to our like using us as a company. And of course, the word would start to spread like wildfire. Another thing we would do too is, our competitors were notorious for not paying either. So they would come in, take the good stuff, leave a mess, not pay. So we started to just pay up front, and we would form contracts. And so we had all this equipment ready to go. We would market. And so
Yeah.
one of the big things for us when I got into the industry, back when I had that 6-month interim position, you know, we did buy a little bit of farm equipment or offsite equipment, and everyone was telling me, "Well, you got to buy it around $80 to $120 per ton. That's just kind of the going rate." And having already done a bunch of sales and sales training for a bunch of my past companies, I was able to start bringing that down to about $60 a ton, which goes right to your bottom line. Especially if you're selling the stuff for 240 to 280 a ton, it's big difference. Well, fast forward with Prairie Metals, we had started to figure out, well, we can actually start getting this stuff for $20 a ton.
Wow.
And by the time we brought some salespeople in, we ended up finding a couple employees that these girls grew up on a farm. I think they had one of them just came back from doing runway modeling out somewhere in Italy. And we gave her a company uniform, showed her how to buy farm equipment, and sent her out there. And so I basically taught them how to buy it as low as possible. And then next week, we're going to do objection handling. So, we got on the
Yeah.
phone and they said, "Well, John, what's objection handling?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because we offer them $3 a ton and they just take it.
Yeah.
It's
Wow.
okay. Training's over. So we were able to
Yeah.
basically pick up farm equipment for next to nothing and turn it around and sell it for over 200 and something. So
Wow, that's amazing. Good little technical question I'm curious about is, you mentioned you started paying up front and obviously, trust goes through the roof, people like dealing with you, etc. But I mean, I'm imagining, and I'm the layman here, right? But I imagine there must be so much of this equipment and kind of there must be a lot of crap there, right? Like, how do you decipher, hey, we're picking up this piece of machinery, but how much of it is actually useful metal versus other stuff? Do you weigh it there and pay them on that weight, or do $3 a ton maybe, or whatever it was? Maybe it doesn't matter if there's a bit of crap in there. But how did all that work in terms of your pricing and protecting yourself?
I mean, that's a great question. So I actually had to build a whole process around this. For me, and again, I didn't even grow up around this stuff, so I had no idea. They would say, "Oh yeah, right by the swather and the combine and the disker," and I had no idea. I couldn't obviously let them know that, so I would go back and when I had Wi-Fi, I'd have to Google what these things are and figure out, well, okay, well, what these things weigh. And I had no idea. And I couldn't expect my sales staff to do that either. So I had to come up with a very simple system. And so what I ended up doing is I did a point system. I had a green, yellow, and red category, and they would do checks. And then I'd have kind of like a guideline. And so they would just go around and do the check system. And they didn't even actually know what the checks meant. And I said, okay, multiply the red checks by this and multiply the yellows by that and do the greens by this. And then take that and times it by this number. And that's the price. And
Wow.
and so the farmers would often ask us, well, how many tons am I selling? Or how many tons? Like, what's the price per ton? Because they're so used to that. And the answer was, no, we're not buying the steel. We're here to clean up your farm. And we're not charging you
Yeah.
anything for it. And yes, we're taking this in exchange, and that's how we make our money, but it's not about it's about us coming in and cleaning it up. And then we would talk
Yeah.
about, now you have more acreage. Because if you were farming here and there and you had all the scrap here, now you can connect those two. And if you can grow
Yeah.
that much more canola or wheat or whatever you want to grow, what's that worth? Or what's your house worth if your backyard is not full of dangerous pest attracting scrap, equipment?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was our
That's
pitch.
beautiful. It's I love that. I remember years ago doing this studying negotiation and different things, and I remember the course being led by a very very smart guy. Did a lot of negotiations for the United Nations, but he was sort of saying the whole, what are you negotiating for? And it was the classic, we have a bag of oranges, and everybody, classically is haggling over the oranges, right? And but hang on a minute, what if this party actually only wanted the peels? And what if you just wanted the juice? And what if that person over there just wanted the seeds? And there's a way to actually get more out of this situation than just perhaps what everyone thinks at the outset. Um, I just love this. What you've done there is positioned yourself into this niche with, by the sounds of it, probably no real competitors, and you're able to obviously extract an enormous amount of value for yourself as well as your clients.
Yeah, no, thank you. So that was really the front part, like the front of the house of the business. That's how we
Yeah.
positioned. That's how we sold. And like you said, some of the challenges we had was getting the girls off the farm so that they can go to the next appointment because these farmers love to chat them up, and so but that was the front end of it, and it worked well. Of course, we weren't doing 100% cleanup, 95%, so we had to sometimes explain that stuff to them. But for the most part, farmers talk, and so the business really did explode. The only competitors we had were really just down the road. They were all the people we created our own competitors, and perhaps we can
Yeah.
talk about that with some lessons learned. Um, Earlier, you did ask about, the logistics of things, and did you want me to touch on some of how we did the back end of it?
Yeah, please, absolutely.
Okay, great. So a couple of things for us, having seen how the scrap yards operate, a lot of this equipment was really just in like the trucks that they use, the trailers that they use, they were always on the verge of breaking down. And so for me, I had seen this and started to realize, what's the opportunity cost of us missing one load? And at the time, I had roughly figured one load, like one truckload, was roughly 3,000 of gross margin for us. And so if one truck can bring in between 3 and 5 loads a day, what's that
Wow.
cost of not having that? So I ended up going out and, to buy a rig, it was minimum $250,000. And when you've been in business for 3 months, not many companies want to give you money, especially if you're about to go into a divorce. So, and we had already maxed out those credit cards that came to us in the mail for, 10,000 free dollars for 6 months. And we managed to max out our credit at the auctions already. So what do? So then we went and approached all the truck dealerships, in that whole radius, and started to pick up a couple trucks here and there. Now these trucks were like $2,500 a month plus $1,500 a month in insurance. So they're very expensive because they're very expensive trucks. Comparatively, when I would work at the scrap yard, it was probably $400 all in, fuel excluded. And so, at the time, I kept in touch with the owner of the that scrap yard, and he would say, "John, you're crazy. What are you doing? You're going to go bankrupt." And it to the point where we had 2 extra trucks just sitting there at the smelter's yard. They ended up giving us a little bit of land so we can keep our backup equipment there. They ended up sectioning a whole section of their yard for us as well, which I can touch on later.
Yeah.
But so even though we had a high cost on these trucks, I had realized what's the real opportunity cost here? Because really we only had between, mid to end of May until maybe October at best if we had a good fall. And then on top of that, rain days, like we're driving into the middle of fields. So if it's rainy and you got a heavy load, which this sometimes happened, we would break through the ground and our truck could be stuck for a week or two until we drag it
Wow.
out. So if it's a rainy day, we realized like when the sun is, you got to make hay when the sun is shining. So I don't know if that's a saying that you have out there, but it
Certainly is.
definitely
Yeah.
applied here for us.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And so, yeah, I guess that's, for the most part,
It's,
yeah, go ahead.
it's fascinating. Sorry, yeah, and I'm jumping in on you, but it's fascinating to hear. I mean, and this goes to the heart of every single business, right? I mean, we can oversimplify things and say, well, every business you've got to somehow, generate leads, close them, do the sales, and then somehow do delivery so you extract the value. But geez, at each step of this chain, it's at a surface level, your business looks really simple. Oh yeah, we pick up scrap metal and we sell it.
Yeah.
No,
No.
it's not that simple, man. It's actually really quite complicated, and there's all sorts of stuff. And what a learning journey! I mean, you've really had to evolve and adapt to make this the success it was.
Yeah, and, one of the key things, for us, and it's, I think we both talk about value builder. I think you're involved as well, and the timing of cash flow is so critical.
Yeah,
And that's something that we definitely figured out very early. So
yeah,
we learned with our vendor. So our vendor was the scrap metal smelter. We can pick up our checks same day we delivered the load. And so that
yeah,
was huge. And then I started pushing all of our vendors to net 30 terms. And then I convinced a whole bunch of them to take credit card after those net 30. So this is how we were able to scale quickly because we were essentially borrowing off of our vendors. And we weren't,
yeah,
and I say that cautiously because I don't encourage anybody stretches a vendor out, beyond the agreement. That's a no-go zone for me. I don't encourage that for anyone, but we were doing this within the terms that we had agreed upon, and
yeah,
sometimes 50 days, 60 days, so that as we were growing, we were able to deliver a load. And sometimes I would be driving back to Regina twice a day, an extra 3-4 hours of driving at the end of just to go pick up the check and bring it to the bank because, hey, we were in startup mode and we needed that money to buy the next magnet for the next rig so that we can keep going.
yeah. Wow. But you're right. Cash flow. I mean, everyone knows cash is king, right? But this, what we call the cash gap, obviously, right? Between the gap between you spending money and getting cash in again.
If you're a business that asks for money up front for a deposit, just ask for a little more and just ask for a
Yeah.
little bit earlier on for the next payment. And it could make a significant difference.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. It's one of those things. You're right. I mean, what's the effect of you putting up your prices by 3 or 4%? Would your customers even notice? Most of them probably not. But 3 or 4% there, if you were able to trim a few costs for 3 or 4%, companies can go from basically in the red to getting their head above water again, right? So it's it can make a massive difference. But John, I'd like to shift gear if I can a little bit because I'm cognizant of your time and very appreciative of it. But love to talk a little bit about the exit and curious, if you could remind us, I guess, how long were you in business, in this company, and at what point during that journey did exiting start to become a discussion point?
So after the first season, we had a good season. I ended up buying my founding partner. He just wanted to go on to the next thing, and so he went on, and that was almost to be expected. He gets bored very quickly, so I bought him out, and then I brought a new partner in within the second year, and that's when we really started to refine how do we bring our margins as high as we can, and so we ended up scaling this thing to like a I don't know if scaling is the right word, but we had brought it up to a 67% gross margin. So we were, it was a
Wow.
highly profitable business, at least for a couple of 20-year-olds or 20 something year olds. And so,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
um, and Unfortunately, that was a little bit of one of my lessons learned, is that I had brought in somebody, that second partner, uh, without having the ink dried on his contract. And, there was so many legal, you know, delays. Like, if and this is something I would say to anyone: if you want to kill a deal, just leave it up to your lawyer or accountant. But, without any, boundaries, right? Just give it to them. It's as much as we're their client, we still have to direct them. So in hindsight, I
Yes.
didn't know that, and this thing just kept dragging. So the season had to start. So we did. I taught him all my trade secrets. I showed him how we did absolutely everything. And then at the end of the season, he, wanted an advance on profits and dividends. And in my ignorance, I did. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. And so sure
Yeah.
enough, he just walked away. And the next day, he was, next door to us. All of his documents basically whited out our name, wrote his on top, and there were photocopies. Took half our staff. All of a sudden,
Wow.
surprisingly, was calling the same farmers. And so it was really unfortunate that's I manufactured my first competitor right there.
Wow.
So that made it pretty tough. It really started to wear down a bit on the margins, etc.
Yeah.
And
Can I jump in on you for a second, John? I just, because it's such a critical issue, right? I get asked a lot, and I imagine you do too, given the sort of advisory work you do. But I get asked a lot about bringing partners in. I get asked a lot about giving equity to employees and stuff like that. And I've seen it done extraordinarily well. And I think you've just kindly shared an example of how it can really work against you. This idea of bringing partners in can be enormously fruitful, but geez, you've got to get your ducks lined up properly, and not just from a personality and skills perspective, but geez, the contracts, the terms, how we engage, like it can really be a make or break kind of scenario, right?
absolutely. I mean, you know, at least for us here, and I'm sure it's pretty similar. Um, you know, Pretty much we're all in the Commonwealth, and then even in the US, it's probably worse. Possession is 9/10 of the law. And so for us here, I say this to friends or even clients, like, if the lawsuit's for anything less than a quarter million, just forget it. Because it's not worth your energy, your resources, the money, not to mention. And so yeah, you really have to be careful, and you can't trust on the legal system. We don't have a justice system, we have a legal system,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
correct.
And you cannot trust on that. And then I think a lot
Yeah,
that was a very naive view of mine. I didn't have any business really that sorry, family members that were in business. I didn't know that. And I thought, you just call them up and we can get in front of a judge. Well, it doesn't work that way. Um, yeah. So you really, really, and furthermore, if anybody asks me, oh yeah, I want to get, I really ask them, why do you want to get business with them? Are you
yeah,
sure you can't just do some highly commissioned position where maybe you give them a little bit of a base or an advance
yep,
towards commissions, which is a little bit more creative, so that they do non-performance, at least maybe you claw back or whatever. But do you
yeah,
really need to be a business owner? What's really the advantage there? Like this, and I'm sure you touch a lot on this too. Is you have to have that synergy. I've seen some partnerships come together where one had all the grain contracts to sell across Canada, and one had all the rail contracts to move the grain across. And so when they came
nice.
together, it was beautiful. That
Yeah,
makes sense. But if it's just because you guys get along well, or you're
yeah.
related, I would highly caution against it.
Yeah, I think
So
that's great advice. And I think the other one I'll add to it is I've seen business owners, and they've struggled to, I think, be honest with themselves about this, but I've seen people wanting to partner with others just because they were nervous about being alone on the journey. And being an entrepreneur and being a business owner can be a very, very lonely journey. But I would say, if you're feeling that, if you're listening to this and you're feeling those kind of those type of emotions, or you're experiencing that, is that's what good advisors are for. That's what good, you can bring people on the journey without them being a business owner as well. There's lots of other ways of incentivizing them, from shadow equity to various other things. So yeah, look, I would just say if you want to know more about that stuff, reach out, because there's lots of information, right down from different incentive programs, right down to the type of insurances you can have, right down to the type of contracts you need to put in place. And I'm very happy to refer people on to very good lawyers who will look after you. So yeah,
Fantastic.
get that part right. Yeah.
I do hear a lot of that now with my advisory work. Handful of my very tight clients, a couple of them I actually tried to wind it down because I was doing less of the hands-on work and I was doing more of the advisory. And they said, you can't leave us because you're like a business partner, but without having to give you the equity. You have to stay. So I was like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, good point. One thing that really helped me as well is that I joined a group called EO. EO Canada was our region entrepreneurs organization, and that was really great. So if you're feeling lonely and you feel like you need to bring a business partner in, just go join a peer group like that. And I would really caution against that. So
Yeah.
admittedly, I brought that partner in partially because I was, a little bit on that lonely side. And the other part of it was I was really getting dragged into court. I had a very difficult divorce. It was never ending. I was constantly having to be pulled into a different province. And so thankfully I was very good at building systems. Before I was already able to run 3 companies simultaneously. So I just did what I do. I built some systems, brought somebody, gave him everything I knew, trained him from a distance, and basically dealt with this a never-ending divorce, or at least it felt like it. And so that was the risk. Is now I open the kimono, I let the fox into the hen house, as they say, and he thought he was the magic simply because he was the boots on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. At
Yeah.
that point,
Interesting. And
to
sorry, go
answer
on.
your earlier question, sorry if I'm meandering a little too much. To your question earlier, that was basically when I got a sit down from. I had a team of lawyers, unfortunately, and they said, "Look, you're going to have to make a decision. You've got a son with your ex-wife. She's just not being reasonable. So you're going to have to make a decision. Do you want to see your son, or do you need to keep your business in Saskatchewan?" Because they lived in Winnipeg, which is where I live now, in Manitoba. And so you just got to make that decision. So, which was, a huge blow, because for anybody who's started companies, they were both my babies. So I got to make a
Yeah. Yeah.
decision now. And, this is at the time, I didn't realize it as much as I do, later, but, unicorn startup. And, so that's when I started to think about, okay, what does exit look like for me?
Yeah. Well, it's I'm sorry that it sort of had to come to that juncture, but it's obviously hey, we always say family comes first, right? At the end of the day, it's so I can completely appreciate why you went down that path, but it's can you tell us a little bit about what did the journey? So once you made that call, what did the process look like? How long did it take? How did you find? Did you use advisors? Where'd the buyer come from? All that juicy stuff.
Yeah. And so just before I jump onto that, and thank you. I do mention that, though, even though some people tell me, don't talk about the divorce stuff. Nobody wants to hear about that. Um, the reason why I mention it is because oftentimes when so you're talking about selling your company, and some people say, "Oh, I'm not going to sell it till I'm way later." And the reason I mention that is because you sometimes don't get to choose when you have to sell. And so that's why
Absolutely.
it's critically important to have something ready in case something sucker punches you or blindsides you. And so that's, why I bring that up. Nobody likes to talk about divorce otherwise. So moving forward,
Yeah, but your,
okay,
your point there of build a saleable company, whether you want to sell it or not, right? That's the point.
exactly, exactly. And and if you build those systems so that it's a saleable company, you have a lifestyle company now. That means you don't have to do everything.
Yeah.
So, from and that was a really interesting side point. So I now came back to Saskatchewan because my partner had left and stolen a lot of my intellectual property and staff. And of the staff that did stay, because they saw what I had built, it was really interesting because I was like, okay, well, let me help out with sales, and my sales girls were better than me. They're like, get out of here. I'm like, oh, okay. So I try to help out with the drivers, and they're like, no, 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 we've evolved the processes and we've updated all the doc. oh, okay. And because, and it was a really, at the time I was like, oh, I'm trying to help, but they had really taken this idea of a system and continuous improvement. We had built this, incentive programs where everyone was in line, everyone was rowing in the same direction. And so non-performers were immediately kicked out. And if there was a hole, it was almost like a self-healing system where the guys were just so tight. At that point, we were like, okay, let's just keep going for now, and I need to figure out what to do. So if that wasn't enough, then this was in 2000 and shoot, I forget the year now, but we had a commodity crash, and so now that affected our prices significantly. So even though we had a buying contract with the steel mill, and orders from Moscow said, the heck with them, close the doors, we're shutting them down. And so now we had a new challenge to deal with. And we had to shut down basically end of August, early September, which was basically, those were our gravy months. You worked earlier up to pay for everything. And then September, October, that's when you made all the profits. So that was a really tough year now. And then we had to park everything and wait because the prices were now lower than our cost to deliver the steel. And so you might be asking yourself, well, how the heck does this lead to an exit? This is what I think the interesting part is that the story doesn't end where we sold for like umpteen times exit, because we actually had no revenue. And it was actually an employee that stepped in and said, I know how much money this thing makes. I know how well this thing runs. I'll buy it. And we weren't even running. The market was not profitable. I mean, it's a commodity. We knew it was coming back. Steel is a backbone of our economy. And for me, it was okay. I need to be back now to take care of families. So that was really the exit that presented itself to me. Was an employee that got to see and live through all of the systems. They saw how well this thing ran, so the due diligence was fantastic.
Yeah.
And they did. I didn't, considering the market was where it was. It was amazing that I even sold it. So I sold it for quite a bit, considering where it was. And then, a few years later, the market came back and they are doing phenomenally well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think nothing like an employee to understand the risks and relative risks of the business, right? They've seen it from the inside out, which is the best perspective to see it from. Um, can you tell me what was the business turning over at its peak?
Turning over, and do you mean like profitability
Rev-
or sales?
well, I meant revenue because I thought it was probably less sensitive, but
Yeah, no, like our first year we did like 5 million in sales, and I think we brought in like 1.2 in EBITDA or EBITDA.
yep,
And then the next year, steel prices were starting to drop. So we brought in, I think, 4.8 or 4.6. Apologize, it's been a little while now. And then, but we
yep,
had managed to squeak out 1.6 because we started to refine. And then
yeah,
that third year, this is not the year that things closed. So we had pulled out like I think 4 million EBITDA, or sorry, 4 million in sales, and pulled out like just over a million in EBITDA. So we just kept getting better and better at, and it's as a lesson. And to me, someone had told me this. Um, they told me, no matter how good you are at your business, because someone had advised me on this. Because at the time I was thinking, hey, I'm doing pretty good. Like I feel like Superman. I don't know anybody else has done this well my age, in my
yeah,
area. And but someone told me, it doesn't matter how good of a swimmer you are in if you have to fight against receding tide. And
yeah,
so all of a sudden, that is exactly what I felt. We were doing great, but then when you can no longer uh, sell scrap for what it costs you, like we had to shut down. And so it was very expensive to store the equipment. And so at the time when he bought, we were at zero.
yeah. Yes, it's. I think it's a really really good point. We talked a little bit about this macro environment and how pretty much it opens and closes opportunities all day long, and that's the only reason you have a business is because the environment has created an opportunity that you can seize on. So it's yeah, I mean, if that as you say, tide is going against you, you want to read the signs fairly quickly. I think it's yeah, certainly if you want to get out with your shirt on your back. So. Um, can I ask, how did you and the employee, and we don't have to go into exact numbers or anything if it's sensitive, but how did you come up with the number? Was it a multiple of previous EBITDA? Was it just a fixed asset? Like just broadly speaking, how did you come up with it?
At first it started off with a multiple of EBITDA, but it wasn't even. Of course, it wasn't a. It was like not a great multiple, but then it really transitioned to, okay, what can you get financing for, and how can we do a vendor take back for the
Yeah,
rest? And so
yeah, gotcha.
and so being willing to do that allowed my price to definitely stay up quite a bit.
Yep.
But of course with risks, and thankfully I didn't have to do an earn out or anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, with an employee taking over, I guess it's they're not worried about the business running; they know it. So, yeah, look, that's really interesting, John. I could pick pick this stuff apart all day with you, but it's I'm a little bit cognizant of time. Maybe we could you could just give us a quick overview of what are you doing these days now that you've exited and you've moved on.
Yeah. So, the divorce did take 10 years. I did lose custody of my son for 2, 3 years. And about a year after I sold the Prairie Metals, I got my son back, and maybe a year or two after. And so at that point, I started another company, sold that. And I realized, now is not the time to go turn another company around. So I made consulting and advisory work my primary. I do work with business owners that want to build systems, want to be prepared to sell, but aren't necessarily wanting to sell tomorrow. And it's been great because I knew that I couldn't get out of the game. So I get to live vicariously through my clients and their employees now, and I get to see the
Yeah.
impact through their organizations.
No, that's very cool. That's very cool. I think, and I know we touched on this at the beginning before we came on the show, but I think we have this shared mission around that, right? Like business owners, they are the backbone of the economy. They are the ones who are employing people. They are the ones going out there and starting businesses and making a difference and solving problems. And, they're certainly the hero in our journey, as I know they are with you. So it's great to see people like you out there helping people and helping them on the journey and hopefully helping them exit on their own terms and getting to live the kind of lives they deserve. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. And if anybody's listening to this and hearing that story about Prairie Metals, keep in mind that, even my company after that I started, and it was in the concrete industry, it did not scale up like that either. So not every story you hear on a podcast or read in a magazine is like that. So I often find a lot of business owners that are quite cognizant of themselves or hard on themselves. You're probably not doing as bad as you think, and but there's always opportunity to grow. And so I agree with Simon. Reach out, find us an advisor that you connect well with, that you can trust, that has the credentials, the reputation, because yeah, it can be lonely, but don't beat yourself up. Not every startup is like the one I explained with Prairie Metals.
Great advice. Great advice. Jean, are you okay with people reaching out to connect?
Yeah, I love that.
Cool, cool. Well, listen, I've got your LinkedIn address here, and we've got your website at growthstrategy.ca. But for people listening, we will put that stuff in the show notes to make it a little easier for you. If you do reach out to Jean, please give him a little note in there. Just let him know perhaps that you heard him on the podcast so he understands where you're coming from and it doesn't feel so random. Would be polite and nice. But other than that, look, John, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your story. You've been very gracious and yeah, look, I've certainly taken a few things away from it, and as I'm sure all of our listeners will too. So thank you again.
I mean, I had lots of fun, and yeah, please make sure that you mention that you heard us on the podcast, and my assistant will. I'll make sure she gives you a link if you want to book a time, connect, and whatnot.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. All right, for everyone listening, thanks for joining us on the show. If you would like some contacts around lawyers or looking at contracts for partners, insurance, key man insurance, all that sort of stuff. We have some fantastic people that we work with. We do not get commissions. We do not make money like that. It's not the way we work. We just want business owners to be protected and be able to have the best tools in their hands. So reach out. We're happy to share. And thanks for joining us on the show.